The story of the Middle Ages does not begin with a flourish, but with a long, quiet exhale. For 5 centuries, the Roman Empire had been the pulse of the Western world. Its roads were the veins of commerce, its legions the muscles of an unstoppable state, its laws the skeleton that held civilization upright. By the late 5th century, that pulse had grown faint. In the year 476, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustulus, the Western Roman Empire did not simply vanish. It fractured. The grand marble forums of the Mediterranean fell silent, replaced by encroaching forests and the sound of iron striking iron. The era that followed was once dismissed as the Dark Ages, a term that suggests a void of culture and intellect. In truth, it was a time of profound and painful transformation. As Rome's central authority dissolved, the infrastructure of the ancient world crumbled. Aqueducts ceased to carry water. Roads that once stretched from Britain to Byzantium were reclaimed by mud and weeds. Literacy, once common among Roman citizens, became a rare skill, preserved only in the quiet corners of monasteries. Europe was no longer a single world. It became a mosaic of territories. Across the continent, borders were redrawn by blood. From the forests of Germania and the frozen north came waves of migration. The Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, the Saxons. They were not merely invaders, but entire peoples seeking land and survival. They brought warrior codes, kinship traditions, and tribal loyalties. These fused with the lingering bones of Roman administration. The horizon of life shrank. Where once it spanned an empire, it now ended at the edge of a village. In this climate of constant threat, a new social order emerged not from philosophy, but from necessity. Feudalism was born. With no central army, protection fell to the local strongman. The Roman citizen vanished. In his place stood the medieval vassal. It was an unspoken pact. The weak gave labor and harvest. The strong gave shield and sword. Europe's landscape hardened. Wooden palisades became stone keeps. This was the Age of Lords, where power was measured in land and in armored horsemen. At the summit stood the king, whose authority often depended entirely on the loyalty of his great lords. Beneath them were knights, a new class of professional warriors, forged for mounted combat and lifelong war. At the base stood the peasantry, serfs bound to the soil. They were the engine of the medieval world, carving fields from heavy northern clay with iron ploughs. Their lives followed the rhythm of seasons and command. There was no ladder to climb. One was born into a station, as if by divine decree. A man was defined by his service. The lord fought. The peasant worked. The ancient Mediterranean world had faded. Power shifted north, into forests and plains. Chaos settled into a rigid order. Those who fight, those who work, and those who pray. Yet steel and soil could not fill the void left by Rome. The secular empire had fallen, leaving behind a hunger for meaning and order. While lords raised castles of stone, another fortress was rising in the hearts of the people. The old gods faded, and in their place, a new power spread across Europe, one that claimed authority not from kings, but from heaven itself. As the fractured kingdoms of the West struggled to find their footing after Rome, a single institution emerged to bind a broken continent. The Christian Church did more than offer spiritual refuge. It became the successor to Rome's administrative soul. While the city of Rome fell as a political capital, it rose again as the spiritual heart of the West. In an era of near-total illiteracy and fragmented rule, the Church possessed the last universal language, Latin. Its reach ignored borders. Its authority claimed to transcend kings. This was the age of the Church triumphant. At the center of this spiritual empire stood the monastery. Far from the violence of feudal courts, these walled sanctuaries became vaults of memory. In silent scriptoria, monks labored for lifetimes, copying the surviving texts of antiquity and scripture, one page at a time. They preserved medicine, agriculture, and theology. They saved what could have vanished. Monasteries were not only houses of prayer, they became engines of renewal, draining swamps, taming forests, feeding the poor, sheltering the sick. In a world without institutions, they became civilization's last refuge. Then, in the late 8th century, terror arrived from the sea. In 793, Viking raiders stormed the monastery of Lindisfarne. The shock echoed across Christendom. From Scandinavia came fleets of longships, their shallow hulls able to strike deep inland. Rivers became highways of destruction. Churches and towns burned before defenders could even assemble. The Viking Age had begun. But the north was not alone. From the eastern plains came the Magyars, lightning-fast horsemen shattering the borders of Central Europe. From the south, the Islamic caliphates expanded across the Mediterranean, turning the sea into a battlefield and threatening the shores of France and Italy. Europe stood under siege from every direction. This pressure hardened feudalism into steel. If a king could not protect his people today, loyalty shifted to the lord who could. Stone fortresses rose across the landscape. Europe became a grid of defensive cells, each lord a wall, each castle a shield. Yet something unexpected happened. The invaders did not remain outsiders. Vikings settled. Magyars converted. Pagan warriors laid aside their gods and accepted the cross. The enemies of Christendom were slowly absorbed into it. The warrior class began to change. The church sought to tame feudal violence through the peace and truce of God, defining when and whom a knight could fight. The sword was no longer merely a tool of plunder. It became an instrument of divine purpose. By the end of the first millennium, survival had become momentum. Europe was no longer merely defending itself. It was mobilizing. The papacy now wielded authority rivaling emperors. The warrior elite stood ready. Faith and steel were aligning. The walls of the early Middle Ages were about to become launch points. A new idea was forming in the medieval mind that war itself could be holy, and that a man might kill not for land or lord, but for God. By the end of the 11th century, the energy of Western Europe could no longer be contained within its own borders. Feudalism had created a surplus of landless knights, men trained for war, with no inheritance to claim. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II redirected this volatile force toward a single, transcendent goal: the recovery of the Holy Land. His words ignited a movement that would define the High Middle Ages. Dies Vult, God wills it. The Crusades were not merely wars, they were armed pilgrimages, a fusion of devotion and violence. For 2 centuries, waves of cross-marked warriors marched toward the Levant. This era gave rise to the military orders, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, warrior monks who took vows of poverty and chastity, yet wielded the sword with ruthless efficiency. Across the Middle East rose colossal crusader fortresses, stone citadels blending European, Byzantine, and Islamic engineering. They stood as symbols of both faith and conquest. The Crusades failed to permanently hold Jerusalem, but they transformed Europe. Isolation shattered. Silk, spices, and forgotten Greek philosophy flowed back westward. Trade expanded, curiosity awakened, a cultural reawakening began. Yet beneath this epic struggle, Europe's true heartbeat remained in the soil. The High Middle Ages became an age of growth. The climate warmed, growing seasons lengthened, agriculture pushed northward. The life of the peasant revolved around manor and parish. From dawn to dusk, existence followed the rhythm of the plough. The open field system forced neighbours to work together. Tools, oxen, and labour were shared. Life was harsh, but it was not endless toil. The church calendar brought frequent holy days, moments of rest, feasts, festivals, brief reprieves from the grind of the earth. As harvests improved, populations rose, and with them came the rebirth of the city. For the first time since Rome, towns emerged as independent centres of power. These burghs were cramped and chaotic, timber and stone pressed tightly together, but they offered something the manor never could: freedom. A medieval saying captured it. Town air makes you free. A serf who lived in a city for a year and a day became unbound. Within these walls, guilds flourished: blacksmiths, weavers, masons. They regulated trade and craft, forming a new middle class. Their loyalty was not to lord or sword, but to contract and coin. Above all rose 2 great symbols of medieval authority: the castle and the cathedral. Castles evolved from wooden mounds into concentric stone fortresses. They were not only military strongholds but centers of administration, physical expressions of a lord's right to rule. At the same time, Europe's skyline changed forever. The heavy arches of Romanesque churches gave way to Gothic heights, flying buttresses, towers of glass and stone. These cathedrals were Bibles carved into architecture. They lifted the eye. They dwarfed the human form. They made faith visible. By the late 13th century, Europe stood at its zenith. Universities debated the universe. Trade routes reached China. Cathedrals pierced the sky. The population had tripled since Rome fell. Forests were cleared. Marshes drained. Every arable acre was claimed. The continent had reached its limits. This prosperity was fragile. It depended on a climate that was beginning to cool, on a system stretched to its edge. As the 14th century dawned, rains fell. Harvests failed. Expansion ended. A shadow crept across Europe. A shadow no wall could stop. No sword could cut. No prayer could turn away. The 14th century arrived not with triumph, but with silence. By 1347, cooling temperatures and relentless rain had already pushed Europe toward famine. Then death arrived by sea. In the holds of merchant ships docking in Sicily, an invisible passenger prepared to dismantle 1,000 years of order. The Black Death swept across the continent with merciless speed. In less than 5 years, nearly half of Europe's population vanished. The plague spared no one. Monk and peasant, noble and king. It was a democratic executioner. Terror dissolved society. Parents abandoned children. Priests fled the dying. The church, once the unshakable bridge between God and man, could no longer explain why the righteous fell beside the wicked. The foundations of the medieval world began to fracture beneath the weight of unburied dead. Yet from this devastation emerged transformation. With the workforce destroyed, labor became power. Survivors realized their worth. Serfs demanded wages. They demanded movement. They demanded dignity. Feudal bonds cracked. Revolts erupted. Fields stood empty. Land was abundant. Hands were rare. The old hierarchy could no longer sustain itself. The Middle Ages were being reshaped, not by divine decree but by economic reality. As the 15th century dawned, the final pillars of the old order collapsed. For over a century, France and England had waged the 100 Years' War. On the fields of Crécy and Agincourt, the armoured knight symbol of feudal power fell before arrows and gunpowder. Chivalry died in the mud. Castles, once impregnable, shattered under cannon fire. Kings consolidated power. Fragmented lordships gave way to centralized monarchies. The modern state was being born. To the east, the ancient world breathed its last. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The Byzantine Empire vanished. Greek scholars fled westward, carrying forgotten texto manuscripts of antiquity. Their arrival in Italy ignited a revival of classical thought. Then came Gutenberg's printing press. Knowledge escaped its chains. The church's monopoly over learning broke. The medieval gaze, once fixed on heaven, turned toward the human form, toward nature, toward reason. The Middle Ages did not vanish. They transformed. Those 1,000 years were not a void, but a crucible. They built the universities we still attend, the laws we still follow, the cities that still define Europe. In 1492, as the sails of Christopher Columbus disappeared beyond the western horizon, the medieval era exhaled its final breath. The age of sword, plough, and cloister gave way to the age of compass, press, and individual. The arc was complete. Medieval Europe began in the smoke of fallen Rome. It ended in the light of a new world. Between them stood a millennium of struggle, faith, collapse, and rebirth. Legacy carved in stone, written in blood, and carried forward by the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching. If this journey through 1,000 years of history moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps this channel grow and allows more stories like this to be told. Let me know in the comments which historical era or event you'd like to explore next. New journeys into the past are coming soon. Until then, I'll see you in history.